Good morning, everyone. I want to make the best use of our time today. I want to start by welcoming you to our Trauma and the Mind-Body Connection webinar. I hope everybody is doing fine on this Friday morning. We're happy to have you. We have a lot of people that registered to attend today. I don't want to miss anyone, but again, I want to make really good use of our time. I'm going to pass off our presentation to Wallace, who's going to tell you a little bit about one of the programs that we have here at Families Helping Families, and then we'll get started shortly after that.
Good morning. This is Wallace from Families Help Families, and welcome to our webinar. The program that I wanted to tell you about today is called LACAN, and LACAN stands for the Louisiana Council's Advocacy Network. It's free to join this for information. It's part of a statewide grassroots advocacy network. What it does is it links people who are in the group with lawmakers and individuals with disabilities, family members, to make positive change in systems serving people with disabilities. It also helps advocate for policies and systems that support inclusion everywhere where people learn, work, live, and play. It also advocates for systems that support children and adults with disabilities to live in their own homes and be fully included and participating members of their local schools and communities. LACAN leaders provide the connection with the regional team of advocates that provide information on proposed policy changes and how those changes may affect you and others, provide training and skills to effectively advocate for system change, and support you with linking you with policymakers. On the slide is the address for LACAN. It is www.lacanadvocates.org. And you could go there to find out more information about LACAN, or you could call our center and ask to speak to Melinda Elliott, and she will be glad to give you more information as well. Again, like I said, it's free to join LACAN for information and, be a part of that group. So we invite you to join the group if you're interested. Okay, go ahead,
Thank you,
David.
Wallace. I appreciate you taking care of that for us. Okay, I have a few housekeeping things to address. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Davelyn Patrick, and I work here at Families Helping Families of Southwest Louisiana. The housekeeping items I need to address with you. If you're not from here, then you may not know, but if you are, you definitely know. We've experienced some hurricanes in the last couple of months. The other part of the state has as well. So we're going to ask you to be patient with us. And with technology, there are lots of people in Louisiana that either have spotty internet or still don't have internet at all. We have a lot to cover today. Unfortunately, I will not be taking questions at the end of today's webinar, but our host will graciously allow you to contact her directly, and we'll provide you with a copy of her contact information when the webinar is over. The webinar will be recorded, so if you come in late or if you want to listen to something again, it'll be available on our website or our YouTube page, however that works. That's kind of Wallace's arena, and then it'll be available on Vonda's page as well. And then we ask you to be sensitive to watch for and submit the survey at the end of the webinar. Okay, we're pleased to welcome our special guest, Vonda Flue, today. Vonda is an occupational therapist and wellness educator. She's also my friend. Today she'll be speaking to us about trauma. I want to make you aware that this webinar is being recorded. Unfortunately, again, Vonda will not be taking your questions today. Her web address will be listed at the end of the presentation, and you can contact her there with any questions you may have. For the purposes of sound quality, everyone will be muted for today's webinar. I want to let you know that when we finish, you'll be prompted to complete a post-event survey. So please take some time to fill that out for us. With that, I want to welcome my friend Vonda Flue.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Good, all right. My name is Vonda Flue and I'm an occupational therapist. I have about 27 years of experience. I currently practice in both the physical rehab and the mental health settings practice areas. I'm going to give a disclaimer. This information presented in this webinar is for educational purposes only. This information is not to be used to diagnose any specific condition. Neither am I diagnosing or recommending treatment for any conditions or diagnoses. I am providing you with general overall movements or activities that have been shown to help with trauma. However, you are responsible to check with your physician or other medical professional to safely implement any program or techniques. With that being said, what I thought I'd do is discuss briefly about trauma. And trauma is such a big field and there's so many varied definitions. So I went searching for several and looking at things. But just so you know, trauma can be both physical and emotional, or it can be both. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in depth in just a minute. But basically, I have some various definitions that I'm going to read first because all of them had some shades or nuances of some really interesting things that I thought were good little tidbits. And so I'm going to read several definitions of trauma from various websites. They're either websites like the American Institute for Trauma, or they are on a counselor or a therapist page. So one site said it results from exposure to an incident or series of incidents that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. I think it's interesting if you go on WebMD, you can't find, if you look under the alphabet, you can't find the word just trauma. But it does refer to trauma as something that I'm not going to necessarily cover. Well, I'm not going to cover in this webinar, but physical trauma, such as a WebMD says, internal bleeding is one of the most serious consequences of trauma. So trauma can be an injury, such as a wound to a living tissue caused by an extrinsic agent. So a blunt force trauma, if you hit your hand and bust your thumb or something like that. So that is considered trauma in the medical world as well, because that's a big incident and it causes damage. Another website says, in the purest sense, trauma involves exposure to a life-threatening experience. We will cover that more in depth later as well. According to the American Psychological Association, trauma is defined as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. According to Psychology Today, trauma is the experience of severe psychological distress following any terrible or life-threatening event. This one was a little bit less formal definition, but I really liked it. It says some experiences in life are so painful, they cause deep and lasting suffering. That suffering is what we call trauma. Trauma is a deep wound of the heart and mind that takes a long time to heal. It hurts every part of us, our relationships, our bodies, our thoughts, and our faith. One medical health site defined trauma as any unhealed human wound that causes people to get stuck. Okay, and obviously they're not talking about a physical wound at this point, even though they don't necessarily delineate that. If you go to WebMD, you can find some articles on trauma. You just can't necessarily find it in their listing of the alphabetical listing, but they define in one of their articles trauma as an emotional response to a surprising and terrible event. It involves risk to your physical safety or well-being. That's from the professor of medical psychology and the director of trauma and PTSD in New York State. She says trauma can be physical, like being in a car crash, or it can be emotional, for example, like having someone threaten to kill you. Okay, so if we look at that and we look at those various definitions, like I say, I just began to pull a lot and I looked at a lot more than that. But, trauma, we would say, can be physical or emotional, but it's an exposure to a life-threatening experience. I love the part where it says it's a deep wound of the heart and mind that takes a long time to heal, and it causes people to get stuck, is what I most frequently see. It hurts every part of us. I love that part that they put in that one definition. That's where I like to say and talk about today the mind and the body condition. It hurts every part of us, our relationships, our bodies, our thoughts, and our faith. All right, I'm going to look a little bit at what is not always classified as trauma. Now, I want to say this very clearly. I am not saying that trauma cannot arise out of these things. I am not saying that it is not going to either, like say, turn into trauma. There is things that we call big T trauma and little T trauma. Some websites say, say it various ways. But anyways, a crisis. A crisis does not always equal trauma. It does not always equal trauma. I want to give the example. There was a time that when my daughter was little, I lost sight of her in the store. And as the longer it lasted, the more I became in crisis mode. But I found her and it was over. Okay, so remember back when we were talking, trauma is more defined as it's a deep and long lasting wound. You get stuck. So that was a crisis, but it was resolved. It was, and it was gone. Okay. So not being able to find your child can be traumatic, but this instance was not. It did not turn into trauma or long-term trauma, okay? One website says, although the instigating event may overpower coping resources available at the time, it's nevertheless possible to develop healthy ways of coping with the experience and diminishing its effects, okay? So that's what I was trying to say. That instigating event of not finding my child for a minute seemed to be overpowering my coping resources, but there was a healthy way to resolve that. Stress does not always equal trauma. Stress is typically considered a little bit more low key in relation to trauma. Stress can be big though, but in relation to what would be classified as trauma, trauma is usually defined as greater in various ways. Excuse me, in various ways. Excuse me, my voice is tending to fade on the day that I have to do a speaking engagement. So bear with me, please. Okay. So stress is also something that typically comes and goes. When a stressful event or a situation stays around and does not resolve, then the stress can evolve into trauma. Hope that makes sense. Many tests I took, from undergraduate to graduate were stressful, and I may have called them traumatic, but they weren't really traumatic. We tend to use the word trauma sometimes for an emphasis. I'm not saying when real trauma has happened, please, I'm not trying to be insensitive to that at all. What I'm trying to say is we tend to say, oh, that test was traumatic. That test, honestly, that was the word I used. As Dr. Perkis, a clinical psychologist that I trained with, has said before, even sometimes people use feeling words to say how they feel, but they're not a feeling word. Like, I feel stupid. Well, stupid is not a feeling word, it's a judgment word. So they're using, just because they use the word feel, doesn't mean they're using a feeling word. I hope that makes sense. So just because I say that test was traumatic, I'm not necessarily in trauma from that one test or several tests from that teacher. I hope that makes sense. Again, not being insensitive to trauma and real trauma, but wanting to just define that stress is something that we all have and comes and goes typically. It does not stay around and it does not keep us usually stuck, okay? I found on a website a little bit of the history of psychological trauma, and I thought as the more I read it, the more I thought I'd like to go ahead and read it. It really kind of gives a good background of what's going on. And if there is a chat feature, I may need to, I don't know if I need to look. Okay. All right, trauma, danger, crisis, and fear appear to be prevalent in today's unsettled environment. An individual does not have to go further than the television in the living room to see images of death, destruction, and mayhem. The media has presented trauma as the top story or the headline news to the point where they must vie for the most shocking story for the higher ratings. In the 1990s, the public had been witness to numerous occurrences of psychological trauma and people in crisis. Events included, but were not limited to, the advent of road rage, school violence, mass execution of students, corporate violence, airline tragedies, government unrest, and the impeachment of a president. These images take not only a toll on an individual's view of society, they take a toll on the individual's sense of well-being. Prolonged exposure to violence and trauma has severe effects on an individual's psychological state. The need for a model of intervention is paramount to help the individual cope with life's tragedies. We must first define the nature of trauma and crisis, then view the current models of treatment. Crisis, according to Gilliland and James, refers to a perception of an event or a situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the resources and coping skills of a person. I think that's a really important statement. It exceeds an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the resources and coping skills of a person. The event or situation can manifest itself in many forms, but it is the emotional reaction to the event or situation that causes a state of crisis. Again, think about that. If I could fight or flee, flee or fight, it wouldn't be, it may not be quite as traumatic because I could overcome and I could go past that situation. Once again, not always. I'm not trying to make blanket statements for every situation, but there are times where that could happen. The crisis may be too overwhelming for the individual and may cause the individual to respond in a pathological manner. The state of crisis may cause a person to respond with ideations of suicide and homicide. The crisis itself has the potential to cause serious damage to the individual's cognitive, affective, and behavioral states. Individuals in crisis have suffered from a psychological trauma. It is an affliction of the powerless. Trauma renders a person helpless and powerless due to the overwhelming force of the event. The traumatic event causing the crisis alters the individual's belief of a just and fair world. The event or situation destroys the individual's sense of control, connection, and meaning. 3 really good points. The individual, listen to this, the individual's mind responds to this trauma similar to the body responding to distress. The mind will attempt to reach a state of homeostasis. Our body always wants to reach a state of homeostasis. I teach that all the time, and that's a physiological thing I teach as a coping mechanism or to increase awareness during stress. But I thought it was great that he said that. The mind will attempt to reach a state of homeostasis. The psychological trauma represents a condition of acute distress, causing a disturbance in the balanced state, thus creating psychological disequilibrium. This psychological disequilibrium is a result of the individual's usual coping skills failing to respond to the psychological trauma. I just thought that was a real neat, and he has more on that history and when it was studied and other type of things. All right, so the mind and the body connection is what I really want to talk about today, but I knew I needed to give a brief history of trauma. Trauma has to be defined in certain ways because we have lots of research and study on it. So far, we've talked about what trauma is, what it is not, and what it may not be, and and we've looked a little bit at the brief history of psychological trauma and some deeper definition. The mind-body definition. Trauma involves usually that physical and emotional component. Even if the instigating traumatic event is not physical, there will be a physical reaction. I want you to get that. So I'm going to repeat it. Even if the initial instigating event is not, initial instigating traumatic event is not physical, there will be a physical reaction, okay? If the initial instigating traumatic event is physical, there will be an emotional or mental reaction as well. So if I hit myself, if I get injured in a car wreck, I'm going to have an emotional reaction. So I wanted you to see that. If the initial event is physical, there's going to be a physical response. If it's emotional, there's going to be a physical response. So either way we go, we're going to end up with a physical response. All right, so therefore, if the traumatic injury involves both the physical and emotional, then I feel like the healing should involve both the physical and emotional as well, because you're going to store, some people say either the trauma or the response. because people go into protective reactions when they have this overwhelming coping resources. Now, you're going to go into a protective reaction physically when you have a big event come at you, whether it's a person, whatever it is, a car that may be looking like it's coming your way or something, you're going to have a physical reaction. What happens is there's sometimes it goes beyond our coping resources that we have or resources that we have, and then we might go into abnormal coping resources. Does that make sense? Because we are gathering everything. It is just like when I see a child in my clinic and they cannot do something by themselves, so they begin to pull in that other side of the body to stabilize, and they hold their breath and they hold their mouth and they posture that arm and they make a fist or do something, and because they're trying to pull in other resources. So we see that physiologically as well. So I think that since they both involve that component, we need to look at both of those. Unfortunately, in our medical society, we do have two books. One is on emotional, the DSMR, whatever revision it's on, and the PDR, the physician's desk reference, and one deals with physical and one deals with emotional, and they're two separate books. And I think it's obvious we're made where those should be combined and not two totally separate books. I understand specialties, but I think that the emotional side has to be taken into account more than I think it is sometimes, especially even with physical trauma. So let me explain that another way. There's a study, and it's called the ACEs study, if you want to look that up. And there's also a Philadelphia Urban ACE study. But the landmark ACE study and the Philadelphia Urban ACE study reveal that the more a child is exposed to stressful and potentially traumatic experiences, the greater his or her risk for chronic health conditions and health risk behaviors. Traumatic events can have a negative effect on health at any age. Okay, it was one of the first, the ACE study, as one of the first surveys to include additional indicators of traumatic stress. Sorry, this is on the Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Expanded ACE survey has become a model for cities around the country to better understand what residents face in their day-to-day lives. Okay, in the ACE study, it looked at the effects of trauma on health. It shows the connections between unresolved early trauma, and the onset of adult chronic illnesses, both mental and physical. Okay. Methods. I wanted to read this real quick because I thought this was important. A questionnaire about adverse childhood experiences was mailed to over 13,000 adults who had completed a standardized medical evaluation at a large HMO. A little over 9,500 responded. 7 categories of adverse childhood experiences were studied: psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, violence against mother, or living with household members who were substance abusers, mentally ill, or suicidal, or even imprisoned. The number of categories of these adverse childhood experiences was then compared to measures of adult risk behavior, health status, and disease. Logistic regression was used for demographic and other things. Okay, so the results. More than half of the respondents reported at least one, and 1/4 reported greater than or equal to 2 categories of childhood exposures. We found a graded relationship between the number of categories of childhood exposure and each of the adult health risk behaviors and diseases that were studied. Persons who had experienced 4 or more categories of childhood exposure compared to those who experienced none had a 4 to 12-fold increased health risk for alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, and suicide attempt, a 2 to 4-fold increase in smoking and poor self-rated health, greater than or equal to 50 sexual intercourse partners and sexually transmitted disease, and a 1.4 to 1.6-fold increase in physical inactivity and severe obesity. The number of categories of adverse childhood exposure shows a graded relationship between the presence of adult disease, including ischemic heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal fractures, and liver disease. The 7 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were strongly interrelated And persons with multiple categories of childhood exposures were likely to have multiple health risk factors later in life. The results, we found a strong graded relationship between the breadth of exposure to abuse or household dysfunction during childhood and multiple risk factors for several of the leading causes of deaths in adults. Okay, in a summary, we found a strong graded, I'm gonna read it again, relationship between the breadth of exposure to abuse or household dysfunction during childhood and multiple risk factors for several of the leading causes of death in adults. Okay. All right, so basically, there's another study that says people who've experienced traumatic events have higher rates than the general population of a wide range of serious and life-threatening illnesses, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, gastrointestinal disorders, and cancer. An important question for both researchers and clinicians is why this occurs. Researchers have discovered that traumatic events dysregulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, to HPA axis, that's why I abbreviate it, and the sympathetic nervous system. More recently, research from the field of psychoneuroimmunology suggests that traumatic life events can lead to health problems through dysregulation of another key system, the inflammatory response. Prior trauma primes the inflammatory response system so that it reacts more rapidly to subsequent life stressors. Elevated inflammation has a role in many chronic diseases. Recent studies also suggest some interventions that can serve as adjuncts to traditional trauma treatment. And in this study, they said long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, exercise, and sleep interventions. Each of these interventions downregulates inflammation, which will likely halt the progression of chronic disease for some trauma survivors. So I love the studies that are out there saying that there is something that can be done, but there is a correlation if there isn't anything done. And the correlation is not only just to your mind, but it is very much a statistically strong correlation to things in your health and more significantly to your long-term health, because these things are showing up years and years later. All right, so let's look at your body, what happens to your body physiologically during stress and in crisis. I know that we discussed that stress and crisis are not trauma, but there's this great article that I really like. It's called Cortisol, Public Health Enemy Number One. Okay, I've cited it and read it on many of my talks on emotions and emotional healing. I'm going to read you a little bit from that article as well, because it helps people understand. The reason I like it so much, it helps you understand that there is a physiological basis of things that are happening. And unfortunately, if we just had one event of stress per day, if we just had one event of trauma, it would be different, but we have many of these events. So since we have so many of these, if we don't realize what damaging effects it's doing to our body, then it's just going to stay there and stay there. And you're going to be wondering, or people will be wondering, why am I feeling this way? What is going on? Why is this happening to me? When actually what this research shows is it's a cascade of activities that's just not being intervened. There's a really good, I saw the title, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And I did not get to read the book, but one of the things he was talking about is that, and we'll talk about it a little later, but I mean, they don't get what's the word chased every day. It's not every day, several times a day that they get chased by a lion. I mean, we've all seen the Animal Channel. The lion misses and they're tired. They're done for a little while. They're not chasing them. So they can resolve that in different ways. That's why zebras don't get ulcers, I guess. Okay, so here's a little bit from the article, Cortisol. Cortisol is your stress hormone. So the article's called Cortisol, Public Health Enemy Number One. Scientists have known for years that elevated cortisol levels interfere with learning and memory, lower your immune function and bone density, increase weight gain. We'll talk a lot more about that in a little bit. Blood pressure, cholesterol, and heart disease, the list goes on and on. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol levels also increase one's risk for depression, mental illness, and lower life expectancy. This week, 2 separate studies were published in Science, and this article was done a long time ago, linking elevated cortisol levels as potential trigger for mental illness and decreased resilience, especially in adolescence. So cortisol is released, in response to fear or stress by the adrenal glands as part of the fight or flight mechanism. The fight or flight mechanism is part of the general adaptation syndrome defined in 1936 by biochemist Hans Selye of McGill University. He published his revolutionary findings in a simple hang on to that word simple, because we're going to come back to that. In a simple 74-line article in Nature, in which he defined 2 types of stress. Eustress, and that is spelled E-U, and then the word stress, but it's all one word, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, which is good stress. That's like getting married. You say, what's good stress? Well, getting married. Getting married is stressful. Having a baby. It's a great thing, but it's stressful. And distress, which is bad stress. Okay. Both eustress and distress release cortisol as part of the general adaptation syndrome. Once the alarm to release cortisol has sounded, your body becomes mobilized and ready for action. But there has to be a physical release of fight or flight. Otherwise, those cortisol levels build up in the blood, which wreaks havoc on your mind and body. Love that paragraph. Okay. But the thing is also, you have to remember, I'm going to add this in right here, is your mind does not always understand the difference between reality and what's in its head. And I can give you an example of that is because you can role play at a funeral right here. You could sit, we could all close our eyes and pretend, which would be not a great thing to do, obviously, but we could pretend about a funeral, think about a funeral that's going to happen, whether it's for our parents or something. I mean, inevitably, my parents are not going to live forever. I could role play that and I'm going to cry. I'm going to cry. It's not happening. It's not real. My parents are alive and well, but my mind is getting all the images and it's responding just like the event is happening. So taking your thoughts and keeping them under control is and not going off and doing that. Oh, I'm going to think about what I'm going to tell her again. You know what? I'm still mad about it. I'm going to think about what I'm going to tell her again. Oh, you know what else I could tell her? I'm going to do, and you go through that whole argument again. And 3 times you've released unhealthy hormones in your body. And you may do that just one day. And then the next day you're doing it again. And you've gone a month and you're still worrying in the head, but you've released cortisol all of those times. Does that make sense? So, it's profound as to what we think. Okay, so those chemicals are just floating around, damaging structures in our body. Digestion is shut down. So remember earlier he said it's linked to obesity. When you are in fight or flight, you are, I always say, the example I say is you're running from the lion because you don't want to be lunch. Your body's not concerned about digesting your lunch. Okay, it shuts down. It needs resources to live. And it says, I don't care if I digest lunch right now because I may be dead in a minute, honestly, or I may be in a fight where I need all my resources. I do not need my resources to go to digesting my food. So stress, when you're releasing those chemicals and hormones, you're shutting down your digestion. So you can be eating, and I have people that tell me a lot of times, I eat pretty well, but I'm not losing weight, I'm doing this. And one of the things we look at is because stress shuts digestion down. So you're not absorbing the nutrients that you're eating. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay, so think about the long-term consequences of the effect on the heart when cortisol is constantly getting you primed to run or fight. Boom, 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 boom. You've got that elevated. So there's all these heart things they were talking about earlier. Okay, so a eustress creates a seize the day. Okay, whoo, I'm ready to go. You are pumped and excited. It's a heightened state of arousal, which is invigorating, and it's often linked with a tangible goal. You know, let's go conquer and do something. Cortisol levels return to normal upon the completion of the task. So let's say we get everybody together. I live in Hurricane Weary, Southwest Louisiana. Let's say we get a group together and we are going to go clean up at somebody's house, and we are excited. They need the help. You know, like I say, this is eustress. This is good stress. We're going to go out there, but there's a completion of the task. We physically have gotten rid of some of that cortisol, those hormones that are there, because we've done something. We are a very sedentary lifestyle. We are, as typically as Americans. Other countries are more active, riding bikes more often, walking. It's just, so we have a lot of times where we are very much more sedentary and don't get rid of this. Okay, so cortisol levels return to normal upon completion of the task. Distress or free-floating anxiety doesn't provide an outlet for the cortisol and causes the fight or flight mechanism to backfire. Ironically, our own biology, which was designed to ensure our survival as hunters and gatherers, is sabotaging our bodies and minds in a sedentary digital age. Okay, I mean, I know that sounds not positive and uplifting, but some of the things that I'm going to say later, get out and walk, get up and move around, and stop rehearsing so many things in your mind. And I'm not talking that as directly as trauma treatment or anything right now. That's what I'm saying. That's just because I wanted you to understand stress, what it does to our body. Well, that's the same pretty much process that you're going to go through with trauma. It's going to evolve a little differently with long-term trauma, but that's what's happening. So, so as you can see, stress creates an unfavorable environment without movement. Movement and hormones and chemicals just go together. Even as an occupational therapist, when I would go to people's homes as home health, and they had, obviously by the time they got into home health, they had been in the hospital, done their acute stage rehab, and many times gone through the longer term rehab, and then either had done outpatient or they were homebound, so I was coming to their house. So what I'm saying is they had been living with, let's just say, the stroke for a much longer time than if it was just an acute, and their body chemicals just began to change. The spouse would say things like, "This is not normal." They would cry more easily. There was more emotional lability up and down because they didn't have a release. They weren't getting up and moving like they used to. They weren't up, doing things. Just even simple things in the household is a constant moving. And so there was that buildup when you just sit there. And we all know it. If we just sit around for a while, we say, I need to get up and move. Our body is made to move. My computer here can sit for 24/7 and it does not need to move ever. But we are not a computer. We are not mechanical. We are a living organism that movement is a big factor in our lives. So movement and hormones just go together. And when one is reduced, they both are. If movement is reduced, those chemicals are reduced, okay? So this is one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Patty Shackelford. She is a leading instructor with the Mascotova Institute, which we'll talk about that later. Often children who find controlling their movements difficult usually find controlling their emotions equally challenging. I loved it when she said it. I wrote it down. Often children who find controlling their movements difficult, so a coordination and things that they have going on, usually find controlling their emotions equally challenging. And there's we'll talk a lot about that, but it can go both ways because it's the hormones that go with movement is part of that. All right. I have studied a lot of trauma and PTSD courses and trainings through Dr. Svetlana Mascotova. I'll see if I can type that in real quick. And I want to read a little bit about her background to you because I'm going to talk about her at the end. Sorry, it is so small down there that I can't see it. But I don't think I spelled it right. No, I did. With a capital A at the end. Okay, so that is her name. You can look up the Mascotova method. So I really think that she has a very good handle on helping with trauma. And there's some resources I'm going to tell you about from her at the end of this webinar. But I've loved all of her trainings. And the reason I want to give a background is so you can understand where she comes from. So having completed her doctorate degree in developmental psychology, Dr. Maskatova was just beginning her career as a postgraduate instructor and researcher when she volunteered to treat the survivors of the Ufa train incident in Russia in 1989. When faced with the overwhelming task of helping the physically and emotionally traumatized children, Dr. Maskatova quickly concluded that a cognitive approach would be insufficient to reach the traumatized children. So there was this very large train crash, and you can read this on her website, where these children who they were actually, I think my understanding was in like a gifted program, and them, their classmates, their teachers, and family members like mom, dad, grandparents were all going to a trip. I forgot where. And so there was these two trains that were crossing over a ravine, and there was a gas line in the ravine, and the pressure decreased. And so instead of going investigating it, my understanding is they just turned the pressure up. So when these two trains crossed, there was a spark that happened, and it was horrendous explosion because gas had filled up in that ravine, and it just mangled and blew the rail cars. And so these children, where she went to help, she said, I picked up my son and my stuff, and I said, I will help them. And she went, and she got there, and she realized, okay, now she's a developmental psychologist. She said, but a cognitive, just a talk-based approach, they were in shock and trauma. And so this is where she started. And so what she had is someone had come right before and picked up, gave her a little orange book from Brain Gym. And so she said, I remember picking that up and putting it into my suitcase just because I just put it in and went. And so when she couldn't do what she would normally have done with the cognitive approach, she looked back and said, I'll try these Brain Gym moves. And so what she did, is my understanding, I say as I've heard one of the instructors talk that's very close to her, that's one of the help that created the Maskatova Institute, was telling the story. What she began to see was these children had some releases, and some of them were so badly burned they couldn't do the movements. She would say, just think you're doing it in your mind as you watch me. We'll look at that later. Those are called mirror neurons. So she had them do that. Well, she said, I've done type classes with her before, so sometimes I can't remember if she said it or if the other lady said it, that there were pictures on the wall of children that had passed away when they would walk in. It was just devastating to see all that. But the children on her wing weren't passing away the same rate. And so the doctors and other people took note and says, whatever you're doing, teach all of us, we're going to do it, because whatever you're doing is working. And so so she taught them and everything, and then she stayed with them for several months and then left. But when she got back, she said, I don't understand why it worked. I used it and it worked. She said, but I don't understand why it worked. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit more. The Ufa disaster demonstrated firsthand for Dr. Maskatova the dysfunction and pathology that can result in the aftermath of extreme trauma. The surviving children were severely wounded and burned, but they also had deep emotional distress as well. Many children had witnessed horrendous injury and the death of friends and family, leaving them traumatized, generally non-responsive, and as Dr. Maskatova learned, with many primary reflex motor patterns actively present. At UFA, Dr. Maskatova developed real-time techniques that acted to drop the protective guard present in each child's body. That's something that we all do. I would call it a stereotypical movement. When someone comes at us, we should extend, and I should put one hand out a little further, and I should back off a little bit. My front hand that I'm looking at is going to be further away than the hand that's close to me. That's close to an ATNR, which is a reflex that every child does, again, regardless of culture or race. That's just a stereotypical reflex that we do. If those protective mechanisms aren't present, then we say that it is not normal. A child, and I know in OT school, we got to learn the reflexes and how to test for them. And one was to hold the child up above the table and plunge his head swiftly toward the table, so that you would see that now you weren't going to hit the child, but you were to swiftly make that downward movement, so that stimulated the vestibular system, so that, pooh, there was a fast movement and my hands need to come out fast. I did not ever want to test that one, but that's what I need to see. I need to see protective reactions. When I have a child on a ball, I need to see that their hand goes out to the side when their head gets tilted, their body gets tilted a little bit in space. Those are protective reactions. And so she developed techniques that help drop those protective guard because they're good in the instance. In that instance, I need those. But if that gets stuck so that every time I turn my head, my hand goes up, even if nobody's really close to me, that's not good. Then the body is stuck. Like we talked about earlier, the body's stuck and it has a motor, a pattern that it's stuck in, whether you want it to do it or not. You didn't ask that I turn my head and look at something and automatically put my hand up. You don't think that through. Your body just does that instinctively every time. And you're like, okay, I need to stop doing that. That same thing would happen, same thing would happen after like a motor vehicle accident. You tend to, something happens and you look up and that vehicle in front of you is close, and it's a visceral response where you go, and you inhale and your shoulders go up and you're like, whew, okay. So, she remained, her approach paid off as the children began to reconnect with the world. Dr. Maskatova remained with the children for months as each child proceeded through his difficult recovery. Their progress was so noticeable that other areas in the hospital became interested in her work. Dr. Maskatova's burgeoning integration techniques was therefore used with adult survivors as well. Okay, so she built on simple, again, there's that word simple, movement and tactile activities. She says simple is profound. And at first, as an occupational therapist, I took her courses, I can't remember how many years ago, 7 or 8. I've lost track of time of that. And I was like, wait, I don't understand. I need strength. I need those things to go. And they're like, nope, you don't need that. You just need to know that the reflex is present and the body will take care of the rest. And I was like, it worked great. She built on simple movement and tactile activities, hers and the children, as they were able to draw out many psychologically trapped children. The results were nothing short of amazing, with psychological, emotional, and physical recovery times far faster than expected, given the level of trauma. Dr. Maskatova's thesis drove her to investigate all available historical information about reflexes, significant portions of which remained available only in Russia until the late 1900s. Okay, so all of that is on her website, plus a lot more. She has got a very wealth of library of information on the development of reflexes and protective reactions in trauma. She has courses. There's one coming up next weekend on on trauma. I'm trying to think of what it was called. I just got an email on it. Okay, the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. I was talking a little bit about it earlier. Now in a third edition, Robert Sapolsky's acclaimed and successful Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers features new chapters on how stress affects sleep and addiction, as well as new insights into anxiety and personal disorder and the impact of spirituality on managing stress. As Sapolsky explains, most of us do not lie awake at night worrying about whether we have leprosy or malaria. Instead, the diseases we fear, and the ones that plague us now, are illnesses brought on by the slow accumulation of damage, such as heart disease and cancer. When we worry or experience stress, our body turns on the same physiological responses that an animal's does, but we do not resolve conflict in the same way, through fighting or fleeing. Over time, this activation of a stress response makes us literally sick. Combining cutting-edge research with a healthy dose of good humor and practical advice, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers explains how prolonged stress causes or intensifies a range of physical and mental afflictions, including depression, ulcers, colitis, heart disease, and more. It also provides essential guidance to controlling our stress responses. This new edition promises to be the most comprehensive and engaging one yet. I haven't read the book. I was looking at it and I just saw that about it, and I thought that's a summary of what I want to explain today. All right, so we are going to wrap up with some suggestions. Now, again, as I said in the beginning, I am not telling you to do these because I don't know. I don't know what you're going through, and I can't recommend any treatment. But these are suggestions for stress and trauma care that was on websites, so you can look those up. These are general techniques that you can do. I think that you need to also, if you're going to when you're looking at applying them to someone, what stage of the trauma. All of that is something I can't get into on this webinar, but there's some of these that you are always going to do in the beginning, and then some are going to be a little further along the line. One of the biggest things they say is support. Number one thing pretty much everybody says is support, okay? Basically knowing that trauma is a journey, everyone. We will get through this. I will be here for you, all of those things. They say research shows that if someone gets to someone right after a trauma, a traumatic event, let's say it's a car accident and it's really bad, the negative effects decrease exponentially. I was even listening to someone tell about being hit by a car, and someone came alongside and right away, and it was just they attribute a lot of that, and that's just not just one person. This person was actually a leading speaker and writer and author, I guess is what I'd say, on trauma. And but that's what research shows. If someone is there, it helps with not disassociating and everything and wondering and what's going on. Someone's talking to you. Someone's talking to you. Someone's keeping you here and in the present. Someone's keeping you thinking about life, because you have to answer them. You don't want to answer them, but you have to engage. You have to stay in the moment. So this is one article says on Medical News Today, withdrawal from others is a common symptom of trauma. However, connecting with friends and family is important. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, staying in contact with people can help prevent trauma from becoming PTSD. It is not necessary to talk about the trauma with people if it is too difficult. Simply engaging with others can improve mood and well-being. I love, and I used to have it somewhere, I think, but the little thing, and I know this is going to sound so simple, but it's Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. I love Winnie the Pooh. And there's a graphic from the book, and Piglet walks up to Pooh and says, Pooh, and Piglet says, yes, Piglet. I mean, Pooh says, yes, Piglet. And Pooh says, nothing. I just wanted to be sure of you. Okay. I mean, honestly, it's just having someone there. And then the other thing that we have to know with support is that many people that I listen to and talk to as far as treating trauma say this: trauma is pretty much universal. Okay, it doesn't just happen in one area of the globe, and most people will have a traumatic event in their life, even if it's what they consider the small t. But we're not immune to trauma. So you know what? We can also help with each other. We can have empathy many times. Even if it's not the exact same trauma, I still can have empathy that my friend is going something very, very difficult and hard, and I am going through. Again, not equating sometimes that the trauma. What I'm saying is that we can be there for someone just as a support. Which leads me to giving them some space. Number 2, don't always try to converse with them. Don't always try to motivate them. Even if you look at physical trauma for a surgery, they maybe get them up and moving faster than they used to, but they still give them a little time. And they also, when they do get them up and moving, it's very slow. It's very slow in the beginning. And then they gradually work up to a little bit more. And this is physical rehab. And then they gradually work up. And then, you know what I'm saying? It's a long, lengthy process. And we tell people, you know, if you've got a rotator cuff surgery, you're looking at 6 months to a year. That's not abnormal, because those, and I, you know, after I had a bad car wreck a while back, and I really had to experience that firsthand, because I'm gonna tell y'all, I was like, 3 weeks, I'll be in and out. 3 weeks, give me some physical therapy, I'll be in and out. I didn't realize my muscles, my cells, my body was held on for an extremely long amount of time, because it was like, I never want to experience that again. And so and just laying down the physical repair and restoration takes a long time. And we allow that for people. After a physical rehab. I mean, think about it. After you've had a baby, after you've had surgery, you're like, stop, you're doing too much, slow down. You're going to damage yourself long-term. Don't we say all that? So give them some space. This is, again, especially early on. There are days that they say of doing nothing, just let things kind of just settle. So there was a guy that I heard, and I really long time ago, I heard it on the radio, and I thought the guy was telling it, but they may have been reading from this book, but I've always remembered it. And this is many, many, many years ago. In his book, The View from a Hearse, Joe Bailey tells the story of two men who came to comfort him after the death of his three sons. The first came with answers. He said that God had a plan, that God would work it out for good, and that God would give Joe strength. The second man came simply to sit with Joe. He did not speak unless spoken to, but he prayed with Joe and he sat in silence with him. Joe writes that though both men had good intentions, he couldn't wait for the first man to leave, and he couldn't bear to see the second man go. Just sitting with someone and giving them space. Okay. Another one, number 3 that I have is, because I'm sticking to my S words. Actually, I got a bunch of S words, and I don't know, that wasn't my plan at all, but it's kind of interesting, and it'll be funny later because I kind of, try to stretch one of them. But you get the point. I don't know why. I literally was typing in my phone after I'd been, researching and doing lots of stuff, and I just came up with many that started with an S. Somatic. Okay, some therapists use somatic, and soma means body, so they use body-based techniques to help the mind and body process trauma. Okay, so a review of the literature in the Psychotherapy and Counseling Journal of Australia found that body-based therapies could help a wide range of people, and these therapies include different type things, but one they talked about was a touch, and it was just they either tap, some of them in different areas, so you can do some tapping, different things, or you can do some muscle squeezing, just squeezing on the muscles. I'm not trained in somatic therapies. I was just watching some of the people do the techniques, and that's some things they showed. And one of the things they were saying was that because a couple of things, it seems like such an beyond me experience, and I seem like it's overwhelming and it's way out here, but actually I'm back here. And so it's a little bit of grounding is what they say. And the other thing that I find, because again, I think things should be kind of simple. Remember, I've said that a couple of times before, but traumatized people are responding to things that have come into their space most of the time. Okay. Those things have hurt them. And then so what happens is anything that looks like that, it's going to hurt them again. They feel like they're going to be hurt again. So and I know you just got to think this through. It feels like when you have an emotional wound, it's a deep wound. Like think about these things we say, I've been stabbed in the heart. Okay. That's an emotional concept. Well, what keeps me from being stabbed in my heart is my rib cage, and I do have skin over it. So I am not exposed to my heart getting touched all the time. I'm talking about, just even touched. But if you're emotionally wounded, you feel like your heart is raw and it's being hit or all the time. Your gut, your stomach, I feel like I got punched in the gut. Well, that's those things that where we feel like these emotions are inside of us. Touch helps us realize we do have protective things. I do have bones that protect me. I do have skin that protects me. So it just creates an awareness. And sometimes that's very helpful for them. Sometimes they don't feel grounded. They feel like they're all over the place mentally. They're like, my thoughts, I can't gather anything. It's a grounding. Okay. Again, I'm not certified as a somatic therapist, but that is something they do talk about. So, sound. I love to research on sound. Sound is a very, very early, it's one of the first of our senses. It is the first of our senses to develop. Bass music is calming. So think about when someone's in trauma, we automatically, hey, we talk low. Whether it's physical, like when my husband has had migraines or something, when someone's hurting, when they're not feeling good, you automatically lower that voice. When you want someone else to calm down, you lower that voice, okay? When someone tends to be overwhelmed, in distress and crisis, that voice is screaming and loud, and it's, oh my gosh, and it's the opposite end of the spectrum, okay? So I found this article. I thought that was kind of interesting because, again, I'm researching, trying to find different things, and I love the little caveats I find. The bass, and they're talking about the bass guitar, but listen to this. It's unique in comparison to most other instruments because it can create rhythm, melody, and harmony all in one. Think of the bass lines in Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, the main riff of Give It Away by the Red Chili Peppers, or pretty much any drum, bass, or dubstep song. And you can see just how important bass can be. Bass deals with low, deep frequency, which resonate as they emerge from sound systems and create physical vibrations that surge through furniture, the ground, and even our bodies. And that's exactly why humans have such an impassioned, visceral response to these tones. Think about it. You start playing the music and some baby starts dancing. You don't have to teach them that. They start moving automatically. It's a sound we can not only hear, but literally feel as it reaches out from the wall of sound and stimulates us. Just as we physically feel percussion and obey it when it commands us to dance, bass has the power to make us move while also supporting the main melodies and harmonies of a song. There have been several scientific studies done that investigated this phenomena even deeper. One from the McMaster Institute, and I did read that one, from the Music, the Mind, from the Master Institute for Music, the Mind in Canada, led by Dr. Laurel Trainer. The conclusion of her research indicates that humans can pick up on lower frequencies more quickly than higher ones. We respond to them because they're easier for us to detect and follow. So the bass music, what they're saying is the bass music, we feel it, but we also respond to it because it's easier for us to find it. It's easier. So anyways, aside from this finding, however, it's clear that bass is an extremely important element of music for us because not only is it easy for us to follow, it's creating a frequency we can feel, something that sinks into our bodies and makes us move. So, movement is important for trauma. And I'm going to say the bass, I'm saying it because not only your voice needs to be that way, but it's funny that bass music can also be very calming. And I'm just talking about this. Gregorian chants have that bass music. Tomatis has those things. So just a rhythm and a beat, and then we start feeling it. They start rocking. There's music, and it's funny, even when I work with people with trauma, and if I can put music on, it's like that, not say a word. And there's Toby Mac and some other people, and they'll start moving. They may come in and be as mad as can be and just want to sit there and everything, but a little bit of start moving in their body. It's funny, but it starts that process, okay? So, all right, number 5, my next S, slow down, which is hard for me, but I have begun to learn to do it. Because think about that, fast is and it's demanding. And they're immediately going to recoil, and they're immediately going to pull back. So slow down in what you're saying to them. Slow down in expecting fast responses. If they have trauma, sometimes the auditory processing is off. And so they hear you, but the response is slow because they're filtering through all these things that are still in their head. And so allow them some time for some responses. So you speak slower and lower, and then allow them some time for responses and to process. And sometimes it may be much longer than you want, but they're just processing things. Fear is one website said fear is the number one thing that hijacks healing. Well, actually many therapists say that. So if you're pushing them to do something and they're afraid, they're going to just stop. I find that physically when I'm working with children, if they're afraid of standing or whatever, then I've got to find out some reasons maybe why, instead of just trying to force them to stand. Because I may get them to stand, but if I didn't deal with the fear of what was there, then, success has been actually limited. And so I'd like to find out, because why are they not standing? And so I study them for a while and use my clinical observation skills to find out why they're not standing, because fear's big. And so when trauma, pushing them really, really fast is going to elicit that fear response again. Even that MORO, that reflexive action of pull back and hold my breath and then push away. Okay. Sleep. And it is way past our time now, but I would like to come back and do a whole thing on sleep. Sleep is huge for trauma and stress in general, and restoring our bodies. So I just know that sleep, look it up. But I have a long explanation to go with sleep. And so I might just need to turn it into another webinar. I'll tell you this one, slow, deep breathing. Now, You think maybe I used my S for slow and it should have just been breathing, but actually what I was just talking about with the Morrow, and someone has a traumatic event, there's generally an inhale. And that's that first reflex in life, that Morrow, that where the head gets tilted back, the arms come up, the legs come up and extend, and you inhale, and then you got to resolve and exhale. But so many people are stuck in inhale that their diaphragm is just stuck. And so telling them you want to start that breathing gentle before you go to deep breathing. Instead of just put slow breathing at first. Slow, gentle breathing, then go to slow, deep breathing. And the reason I also didn't put breathing is because sometimes I know I would look at, it was funny, I look at my daughter when we were doing different things and I'd say, breathe. And she'd go, I am breathing, Mom, I'm alive. And so you just can't tell someone just to breathe. So there are a lot of good techniques and things on the internet where they talk about, you can put their hands on their stomach and just have some gentle breathing go on. That again, that somatic experiences of just touching my body and know that there's breathing going on. Okay, I'm gonna try to get these last few. I know your time is important. Smile. Okay, where is a smile reflex? And it's really cool how this, look up this study. It's the happiness study by John Achor, A-C-H-O-R. I had the absolute pleasure of hearing him speak. It's on a TED Talk. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at an event, and it was, we were rolling in laughter the whole time. But it basically, smiling is contagious. And there was this hospital that they wanted their ratings to go up, and they did this, I think it's the Ritz-Carlton is from the article I looked at. It's a 10-5 thing. Within 10 seconds, you make eye contact. Within 5 seconds away from the person coming towards you, you smile. And within 2 seconds of the person, you say good day, or you make some acknowledgement. And their hospital ratings went up, their satisfaction surveys. Because, okay, so let's say this. It says, Achor said something that's at the crux of how how happiness spreads. Our brains are designed to be wirelessly connected through a mirror neuron network. Remember me telling you that with Dr. Maskatova? We don't process the world, we co-process. Just as happiness spreads, so does misery. Have you ever stood in line at the registry of motor vehicles surrounded by fidgeting people, rolling their eyes and checking the time every 10 seconds? You may have walked in there feeling just fine, but before you know it, you're just as miserable as everyone else in line. And it's not just that you're waiting, you've actually caught misery like a cold. How do we turn the ideal that happiness spreads into behaviors that change organizations and teams for the better? One cool system is the Ritz-Carlton 10-5 rule. Simply explain, this 10-5 rule suggests that anytime a guest was within 10 feet, I said 10 seconds, within 10 feet, within 10 feet of the person, the staff member should make eye contact and warmly smile to acknowledge the oncoming guest. When a staff member is approximately 5 feet from a guest, a sincere greeting or friendly gesture of acknowledgement should accompany eye contact, and they should smile. Variations have been adopted throughout hospitality industries. It's also been used in settings that tend to be breeding ground for miseries like hospitals. In his presentation, he describes the elegance of this approach. Okay, you don't need to change an individual. You can change the people around an individual. If we're all connected wirelessly, we can create a single positive choice that spreads throughout that network, and we're trained to reciprocate. And when we were in the event, we had to look at the other person, and we had to do this little thing where we weren't going to smile, but the other person just smiled at them. I just sat there and smiled at you, and I just smiled. I didn't do anything else. I didn't say anything else. I didn't laugh. I just smiled. And the other person, the goal was to stay stone faced. And it was funny because it rarely worked. The person couldn't stay stone faced, and you had to be within a certain amount of feet. But what I'm saying is, now again, looking at trauma, I'm not saying go in and start smiling when someone's in the acute processes or any other stage of trauma. You have to decide if that may be an appropriate thing, but that's something that can be uplifting to the person. I know that many times when I was going through traumatic events, physically or emotionally, I would have someone just come sit with me. We wouldn't do much, but sometimes just that smile happened, and I'd just smile because I knew what they were doing. They were just there for me. And for me and my trauma, I knew better days were coming. And there was someone that was showing me that, and that was going to be there for me in that support system. Okay, so I just think these are interesting caveats to know that you can do some things for someone. Smell. Smell is in my domain of practice as an OT, but I'm also an aroma freedom, a certified aroma freedom therapy practitioner. And the sense of smell is biologically linked to your emotional center of your brain. You have your parietal lobe, or your frontal lobe, your parietal lobes, and your occipital lobes. Your emotional lobe or your limbic lobe is in the center of your brain. And the only access that your emotional part of your brain has to the outside world is through your nose. Okay, so your nose, the olfactory bulb synapses, it hits the emotional center of your brain directly. It's amazing. It's biologically designed that way. So listen to this. The limbic system, often referred to as the emotional brain, resides within the cerebrum. This portion of the brain handles emotional responses, hormone function, behavior, motivation, long-term memory, and sense of smell. Several other specialized areas reside within the limbic system, including the hippocampus, which is responsible for forming short-term and long-term memories. The amygdala, Dave Lynn probably had a bet as to how long it take me to say that word because it's one of my favorites. The amygdala perceives emotions such as anger, fear, and sadness. It plays a role in controlling aggression. It helps store memories of events and emotions. So that traumatic event is going to be stored in the amygdala. It also plays a role in sexual activity and libido. The hypothalamus controls reproduction, sleep problems, and sleep patterns, and body homeostasis. The thalamus relays sensory information to the cerebral cortex. What is cool about the sense of smell is that a smell goes in, all your other senses go to the thalamus, and the thalamus, which is the relay station, tells it where to go. Okay, that's what he's done. He's kind of like the conductor, the train conductor, and he tells things where to go. But the sense of smell synapses in the emotional center and doesn't go directly to the thalamus. It is a direct impact. Like I say, it is a biologically such a wonderful way for me as a clinician to use to work with emotions. It is powerful because the way it's biologically made. You can't refute biology. It's right there, and physiology. Okay, so in addition to being closely tied to the sense of smell, you can see why our emotions can affect so many other things in our lives, because you saw all those other things like sleep patterns and libido and other things, and memory is in that area of the body. The portion of your brain that governs emotions also plays a part in memory, sexual desire, reproduction, sleep, and overall homeostasis. Okay, okay. My other one, last one is stretching and strolling. I told you I was going to go with the S's, and yes, I could have been walking, but actually once I started looking at it, because I looked at strolling rather than walking, but stretch, you can look that up. It's done with, it's talking about stretching with trauma, because we get tense. Again, remember those you tend to guard, and so stretching helps movements. Dr. Maskatova has some, we're going to talk about those movements as well. But strolling, I actually like strolling better than walking once I started looking at it, because think about it. You can walk from point A to point B and be as mad as you can be. But when you're strolling, you're actually stopping to smell the roses kind of thing. You're looking around at the outside environment. And you know what? In that other viewpoint of seeing the world around me, I might see someone else in need. And it kind of takes me past what I'm going through to realize that there are others that are going through things and I can help. And when people start helping, it is so, so great in their healing process. So get out and walk and move. Experts say it's one of the most effective ways to handle the after effects of a traumatic event. Deep breathing, gentle stretching, and walking are all good choices. If you want to exercise, plan to be a little bit more challenging, that can help too, but don't force it though. If you're tired, it's okay to rest, is what one website said. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show you is, I think I'm going to try to do a screen share here, is Dr. Maskatova, who I talked about earlier, has some videos, some free resources on her site, and also through a YouTube channel. And so I'm going to pull that up and screen share with you just for a moment. Sorry about my taking. And okay, so can everybody see that? I hope. Svetlana Maskatova Educational Institute, and as you can see, there is a video here, and it is called Mascotova MNRI reflex integration for trauma recovery. And let's see if I can get the volume going. So she talks about trauma recovery goal setting, things to the beginning, what's a reflex, what's the protocol, and then you go along, like moving out of reaction and into action. You do not want to go into these movements. You can just play video. And go through some of the movements. Go back there, strengthen your stress resilience and immunity, breathe and move into positive transition. There's a little bit about the neurotransmitters, the introduction, PTSD testimonial video, welcome, and a little promo. So there's videos there, and I love recommending those to people. So I'm sorry I went a little over the time. Unfortunately, I have so much to say, and I wish I could have said a whole lot more. So, but I knew I had so much information. If you have any, I'm gonna see if it turns my screen off, if it shows, if you have, nope. My website is vondaflue.com, and I have a place where you can contact me if you would like to ask for questions. Obviously, I can't take specific treatment questions, but if you have something you would like to talk to me about, my website has a contact area. And I think that's it. Davelyn?
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see her contact information. I want to remind you to please complete our post-event survey. I want to thank you for joining us. I also want you to tell us what other webinars you might be interested in. That's one of the purposes of the post-event survey. She mentioned the sleep webinar. Potentially, Wallace is on top of it because he made a note in the chat to make you aware of that might be something you might want to add to that survey. These are free opportunities, these webinars, to gain knowledge and to learn about new resources in and around our community. And we invite you to attend any that we have available. Again, we'll send out this particular slide so that you know how to find Vonda should you have a question or want to provide feedback concerning the webinar that she did today. But on behalf of Families Helping Families of Southwest Louisiana and my friend Vonda Flue, we would like to thank you again for joining us for this webinar and want to wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you again for joining us, and check out our website, check out her website, check out our Facebook page so that you can get information about next things that are coming up. Thank you again and have a fabulous weekend.